We go. Hey, Michael, how's it going?
Well, thank you. Great to have be on your show.
Oh, well, thanks for coming on. And whereabouts are you based?
Right now, I'm based in East Tennessee.
Well, you've got an accent that's almost English. Are you? What?
Sounds it.
Yeah,
I'm
it
from
does.
Australia originally.
Okay, Australian. That's why the Commonwealth. Yes. What got you interested in the Anunnaki? And am I pronouncing it correctly?
The Anunnaki. That is something that I've been interested in when I came across the books by Zechariah Sitchin. And so he was the person that really put the whole story of the Anunnaki on the map in terms of this group of extraterrestrials that are on a planet called Nibiru that's in this long elliptical orbit of 3,600 years. And that was all based on his interpretation of cuneiform texts that make up the Sumerian records. And we know about the Sumerians because they are a civilization that flourished in the land between the two rivers, that is Mesopotamia, that is between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, which is modern day Iraq. And the Anunnaki are allegedly the gods that actually helped the Sumerians establish their civilization virtually overnight, that we know happened around 3,800 BC.
I'm trying to absorb this. All right, so I'll try and go over it slowly then. So the Sumerians, then, is that the most ancient civilization that we know of?
As far as official historians go, they say that the Anunnaki is the oldest civilization that we have records having existed, and that is dated from 3,800 BC. And then you have the Egyptian dynasties, which began around 3,100 BC. And then, of course, they have the Americas, and they kind of date that, around the time of the Incas and the Mayans. And that's kind of like around the 4th, 5th century AD. So, those are the official records. But we know from Plato's description of Atlantis that there was a civilization prior to the Great Flood. And we know from records that the Great Flood happened around 9,600 BC, because that is the period when Plato described the sinking of Atlantis, because Plato was given the records from Solon, the lawgiver, a Greek Athenian that went to Egypt. And even for the Egyptians, Atlantis was an ancient legend. And so according to the record that Plato got, Atlantis flourished 9,000 years ago. So this is 600 BC. And the Greeks were told that Atlantis flourished 9,000 years earlier, and that's when it sank. And so that's where Plato describes it in a number of dialogues, the most famous being the Critias. And we know that actually that date is correct because that matches very closely the end of the Younger Dryas period, which was around 9,600 BC, which is when official studies of ice core samples show that at that date there was this increase in temperature that led to the melting of the North American ice cap, the Laurentian ice sheets, which were 2 miles thick. So just think the ice sheets in Antarctica, that modern day Canada, modern day North America up to the Ohio Valley was covered in ice sheets 2 miles thick. And all that melted 9,600 years BC. So that matches exactly what Plato said, that Atlantis sank. So that is also part of the official records, but that official historians don't talk about Atlantis. You've got to go to sources like Edgar Cayce to find out about Atlantis.
So, talking about records, then, is your research based on these records from the Sumerians because they had some kind of innovation in record keeping and previous civilizations before them didn't have any means of keeping records? And how did they keep records?
Well, the Sumerians kept their records on these cuneiform texts, and those are what have been studied by modern archaeologists for many, many years. And that's what Zecharia Sitchin got his hands on. And he interpreted that in a certain way. And so the Anunnaki, he dates their origins to around 500,000 years ago. So we're talking way before Atlantis, way before even the mythical kingdoms of Hyperborea, because the Hyperborean civilization is actually mentioned by various ancient historians like Herodotus. So he talked about Hyperborea. So this was a civilization prior to Atlantis that lived in the far north of Europe. So we're talking a time when the northern area of Europe was actually much warmer, and there was a very big civilization there called Hyperborea. So all of this kind of matches the idea that there was some kind of dramatic earth change that led to a shift where the North American ice sheets that were previously where the North Pole was, that the North Pole shifted, and that kind of melted the ice streams, melted the ice sheets in North America, but also turned Siberia and the northern latitudes of Europe into the iced wastelands that they are now. So those are the Hyperborean civilization that Herodotus talked about. But Sitchin dates the arrival of the Anunnaki way before that even. And so that's where we get into texts like the Book of Enoch, and that talks about the arrival of the Nephilim and the fallen angels and the Nephilim. And the fallen angels arrive, and there's no date given for that, but we can make the assumption that the arrival of the fallen angels that's described in the Book of Enoch matches the time that Sitchin says that the Sumerians were being helped by the Anunnaki, that the Anunnaki are a group or a subgroup or somehow associated with these fallen angels that arrive. They interbreed with humanity and create a race of giants called the Nephilim. And so that's actually talked about in the Book of Enoch, in the Bible, Genesis. They talk about the Nephilim, and people wonder, well, exactly what is that? But ancient biblical history talks about giants in Palestine. So there's records saying that the Nephilim did exist, and they were a race of giants. But what we get from Zecharia Sitchin's material and from the Book of Enoch is that they weren't giants in the sense of abnormally tall humans, that they were in fact extraterrestrials that arrived on Earth and conducted genetic experiments where they created this hybrid race of giants.
Wow. Before we get to my questions on that front, then, going back to the tablets, how was the code cracked to interpret this ancient language?
Well, the Sumerian language is similar. Well, cracking that language, kind of like Egyptian, like the hieroglyphs. I think there was the Rosetta Stone, and that had ancient Greek, it had ancient Egyptian, and I can't recall if Sumerian was one of those. But whether it's from the Rosetta, I think the Rosetta Stone was used to crack the Egyptian language. I think the Sumerian language, because it's related to Hebrew, in fact, the Hebrew, like Abraham, was actually a citizen of one of the ancient Mesopotamian cities or Sumerian cities called Ur. And so he left and took with him a lot of the records. That's why the ancient Egyptian stories of the flood, of Noah, pretty closely follows what is described in the Sumerian records. So they were able to crack the Sumerian language using their understanding of Hebrew, the connection to Sumerian, ancient Greek, the Rosetta Stone. So, that's generally how I believe they do it, but I don't recall the specifics on how they did that interpretation.
So are you saying then that some extraterrestrial visitation to Earth, there was a fusion of DNA?
Definitely, there were genetic experiments that happened, and in the Sumerian records, they described a number of experiments that occurred where you had the Anunnaki, these extraterrestrials that came from the Sirius star system, that they came here and they began these genetic experiments. Initially, they just used primates and upgraded primates at the time that were found on Earth with their own DNA to create a worker race that could be used to mine the gold that the Anunnaki needed for their spacecraft. And the story goes that initially the Anunnaki mined the gold themselves, but there was a rebellion amongst the Anunnaki. That the Anunnaki had their castes as well. So you had your leadership castes, and then you had your workers, engineers, and so forth. And the Anunnaki workers rebelled. They said, "Well, we don't want to do this. Why don't you just create some subspecies from the local primate population that can do all this mining and save us the burden?" So that's what they did. And so they interbred the primates with the Anunnaki DNA to create a hybrid. And that's the origin of Homo sapiens, according to Sitchin. But there were a number of experiments. It wasn't just one hybrid that was created and that was it. The first one was the first hybrid was, I believe, androgynous, and then they created the bisexual humans, which today we know as Homo sapiens. But what that tells us is that the Anunnaki were at least one among many extraterrestrial civilizations that have been involved in the genetic modification of humanity.
So, interviewing David Icke then on the bloodlines of the Illuminati, he has postured that these Anunnaki bloodlines, you've described the pyramid system there of workers below the elite. He maintains that these bloodlines have been continued throughout the ages to the present day. Do you subscribe to that?
That's the way it was described in the ancient histories as well. I mean, there's documentation for that. Like there's the King's List, which describes how rule in ancient Sumer passed from direct rule from the gods / extraterrestrials to rule by the hybrids. And the hybrids you can understand as being the giants. And then it describes the human rulers taking over at some point. And the same process happened in Egypt. There's an Egyptian historian by the name of Manetho who actually describes this, that prior to the 30 dynasties that conventional archaeologists studied, that there was the rule by the demigods or the hybrids. And before that was direct rule by the gods. So you have, in essence, a caste system where your highest caste is the gods. Then you have a lesser caste, which is a race of hybrids, which have a high degree or high percentage of the blood or the DNA of the gods. And then you have the humans, who are the third caste. And they are obviously a hybrid creation using a minimal amount of the DNA of the Anunnaki to create Homo sapiens. And so this is where you get the origins of the divine right of kings, that the divine right of kings dates from these legends that at one time, if you go far enough back in human history, that the gods ruled humanity and bequeathed rule to their direct successors, first the demigods, and then the demigods bequeathed rule to humans. But the human kings and the human emperors always attributed their bloodline directly to the gods. So this justifies what David Icke has been saying for decades now, that the ruling bloodline families trace their origins to these gods that existed up to 500,000 years ago, which is why their calendar is very different to the Gregorian calendar. We date our calendar to around 2000 BC. Oh, sorry, 6,000 years ago. Whereas for the ruling bloodlines, they date it back to the Babylonians, to the Sumerians, and even earlier.
So we had a question sent in from one of the viewers, D-Day. Can you ask about the river Amrit? Did it run through Hanging Gardens of Babylon, please?
That particular river, I don't know about. I know the Tigris and the Euphrates. These are the two major rivers there. Amrit, I mean, that sounds like Indian. That could, I just don't know my rivers network in that region of the world well enough. But definitely the river systems were an integral part of how civilizations developed there, that the big cities were placed next to these big river systems. And so this is where the Anunnaki established the first cities.
So, do you think then that the beings that came to the Earth to do this DNA fusion could come back? And what about the theory that there is a galactic organization in existence presently that regulates the behavior of the Anunnaki and other ET races from interfering with humanity?
Well, we have legends of the gods coming back in all cultures. They describe that these gods that once ruled over humanity would one day come back. I mean, and you have kind of versions of that in Christianity, the return of Jesus, or in the Islamic faith, the return of Isa, Maitreya for the Buddhists, and Kalki for the Indians. So all of them refer to the return of the gods or a supreme god. But when we look at the ancient Vedic and Buddhist texts, as well as the Sumerian texts and the Egyptian, it's quite clear that these ancient gods that founded those civilizations weren't in fact gods in the way we think of it in conventional terms of some kind of high dimensional or spiritual entity, that these were extraterrestrials that had spacecraft, that arrived in spacecraft. And if you look at the ancient Hindu traditions, they describe these spacecraft as like motherships, like huge floating cities, and that they conducted war in these floating cities. And the same thing in the Sumerian legends. So these are legends that can be found all over the world, and they all talk about these gods coming back. So this takes us to the present day. And are these extraterrestrials coming back? So this is where I've got a number of sources that I work with. One of them is actually currently serving with the US Army, and he's been on several missions to these locations off planet, and he's talked about one of these missions to the Jupiter system, where the moon Ganymede was where these arriving extraterrestrials were coming, and they were meeting with representatives from leading spacefaring nations, and that they were going there, and that US Space Command was in charge of this, which explains why a number of countries such as the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, Germany have all set up over the last year or so space commands. And so you have to ask yourself, well, why is that? Why are they in such a hurry to set up space commands if we're still toying with rockets and still trying to develop kind of off-planet travel using these large rockets? Well, the truth is that they have developed off-planet travel. They have developed these anti-gravity spacecraft built from the reverse engineering of captured extraterrestrial spacecraft going all the way back to Roswell and earlier, and that these have been developed by different countries, and that they have been using these secretly. And so what's happened recently, though, is that these secret space programs, and I've written about those in my book series. I have a 7-volume book series talking about secret space programs, is that recently these space programs got data on these extraterrestrials arriving in our solar system that were much more evolved than the extraterrestrials who have been here for decades and whose technologies were reverse engineered and where agreements were reached. That we're talking the difference between a type 1 and type 2 as opposed to a type 3 extraterrestrial civilization. That's a typology introduced by Nikolai Kardashev, distinguishing extraterrestrial civilizations in terms of how they develop power, whether or not it's on a planetary, stellar, galactic level. Well, here we've got extraterrestrials returning who are essentially these cedar races that were involved in setting up the human experiment hundreds of thousands of years ago. And they've arrived now to kind of watch this time of transition where humanity transits from being a kind of like insular, very backward civilization to one that actually starts joining the galactic community using some of these very advanced anti-gravity, torsion field, free energy technologies that have been suppressed for many decades now.
What do you think Elon Musk's role is in all this then? Because he said he wanted to get people on Mars and he's getting people up there. And do you think, does he have access to technology that we don't know about?
Well, Elon Musk, from some of the sources I've talked about, has been part of these missions to greet these returning gods. And his job is to get humanity up to speed. There's an Israeli professor who actually helped set up their space program by the name of Professor Haim Eshed. And he said that the Galactic Federation, which is an association of very powerfully, technologically developed extraterrestrial civilizations, were saying that humanity isn't yet ready for disclosure, that they need to have access to more developed, more advanced technologies. And that once we have these advanced technologies, then the galactics will be ready to reveal themselves. So I think that's the job of Elon Musk. I think he has been chosen, and I think he's working very closely with US Space Command. He's working with a number of space commands from other nations. I mean, the latest news is that France has just okayed the deployment of, or the use of, Starlink in France. So you have to ask yourself, well, why would the French allow this, other than they understand that Musk is going to play a big role in helping us transition into a future age where these advanced technologies come online. And so, Musk's development of electric cars, these reusable rockets, is just the beginning of what is going to be a space industry using fully reusable spacecraft that goes beyond rockets, that starts to use some of these advanced anti-gravity, torsion field, propulsion technologies that have been suppressed for decades.
So what are your thoughts on Roswell and Area 51?
Well, Roswell was a crash that really galvanized the US military to start to study this phenomenon seriously. There was actually an earlier set of crashes in 1941 and 1942 in the US. These came into the possession of the US Army and the US Navy at the time. And they began a cursory study of these things, but because of the war and the idea that they needed to first focus on defeating the Nazis, that they kind of like shelved studying these technologies, because they decided at the time, the scientists at the time said, these technologies are too advanced for us. We need to put a lot of resources into understanding these and reverse engineering these. So this will have to wait until after the war effort. So it was with the Roswell crash that everything moved into high gear, that the Truman government of the day created a group called Majestic 12. And soon after that, you had the creation of Area 51 and a secretive facility there called S4. And this facility at Area 51 was where all of the craft that had been captured from Roswell and earlier crashes in Los Angeles and other crashes in New Mexico and elsewhere were taken. First they were taken to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, but when Area 51 was set up in the mid-1950s, they were relocated from Ohio to Area 51 and to this facility S4, and that's when they began to reverse engineer these craft, and that's the origins for the secret space programs. And these secret space programs really date their origins from the spacecraft that had been retrieved, and also agreements. This is one of the things that a lot of people kind of like stumble over. I mean, when I first heard about it, it was hard to believe, but extraterrestrials have reached agreements with different administrations, beginning with President Eisenhower and successive American administrations, and with the Russians, and more recently with the Chinese.
What is the relevance of US Congress holding hearings on UFOs?
Well, that's a very important step, because what it does is legitimizes the discussion of ufology. Because previously, anyone in the mass media, within government institutions, academia, if they discussed extraterrestrials, they were ridiculed. If they discussed UFOs as being interplanetary in origin and having political implications, people were kind of like said to be conspiracy theorists. And that's actually what happened to me. I was a university professor at the time when I got involved in this. And I was told point blank that if I continued this research, that I had no career at the university. And that's exactly what happened. I persisted, that I found that the sources for this information was very credible. And so I was booted out of the university system. But what's happened now is that because of these congressional hearings, the kind of justification given for people like myself who were studying this within official institutions, academia, and so forth, now there's a justification that this is not conspiracy theory, because now you can actually say the US Congress is holding hearings on these, and this is not conspiracy theory anymore, that there is credible scientific data that UFOs are real, that they are operating in the vicinity of very secretive, classified, sensitive military facilities, and that they are deemed to be a national security threat. And so who's behind them? What's the origin of these? Are they extraterrestrial? Are they secret spacecraft being developed by the Russians, by the Chinese? All of these are legitimate questions that can be asked now in any university, in the mass media. Whereas 20 years ago, when I started asking these questions, you were regarded as a conspiracy theorist, and you would be driven out of the official institution that you were part of.
Have you been, what's it called, shadow banned or deplatformed on any of the social media platforms?
Not yet, just because extraterrestrial life and ufology isn't regarded as a threat to the status quo. I mean, there's actually been studies of different conspiracy theories, and so they ranked, certain conspiracy theories. I mean, I don't have to name them because I guess we know what happens if you start naming them. But ufology was regarded as a kind of like conspiracy theory that wasn't something that was deemed to be threatening to the system, because we were way out there, and that's actually that's very true, because I know, for example, I've written a book on the Kennedy assassination, and those doing Kennedy assassination research regard my take on the Kennedy assassination as having fundamentally everything to do with Kennedy's interest in ufology and trying to get control over classified UFO files. That Kennedy research theorists said that's a bridge too far, that you're bringing disrepute into legitimate studies, into conspiracy theories over the Kennedy assassination. And some of these people were angry at me. I mean, they were angry. They were saying, you're trying to demean our legitimate research by bringing in this bogus UFO angle.
Well, maybe we could get you back perhaps at some point in the future to discuss your assassination theory, and maybe we could bring someone else in who has a different assassination theory, because the viewers have got an endless appetite for JFK assassination theory stuff. But Dr. Michael Salla, immensely fascinating. I've learned so much. And could you please tell the viewers where they can find you, support you, get your books?
Sure. People can just go to my website, exopolitics.org. That's exopolitics.org. And I've got a whole lot of books. I produce regular articles and interviews that cast light on everything that's going on. So thanks, Sean, for having me on your show.
Oh, huge thanks for coming on, Michael, and you have a great rest of your day. Cheers.
Cheers.
Take care.